Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here, and I'm very excited to share this important story. So first, I want to start off by showing you this photograph. I've been a photographer for 17 years, and I've taken nearly 2 million images, and this humble photograph is the most important image that I've ever collected. So I'm here to tell you the story of this photograph, and to do so, I actually have to take you to the Ross Sea. It's the southernmost body of water in the world. It's about 3,500 miles south of New Zealand. And to get there, unless you're going to take a C-130 and fly down to McMurdo, you have to get on a ship and cross the Southern Ocean. And I wish I could give you the power when each 30-foot swell lifts the ship and slams it down into the next wave, sending this angry curtain of salt white spray 50 feet into the air. Now, on the extremes of the worst rolls, you can actually walk on the walls as the ship navigates these vast silver-black mountains of water until 5 days later, when the ocean calms to nearly glass and a thin white line separates the sea and sky. And that's the edge of the ice. When the ship cuts through that line, you're confronted, those towering waves are left behind, and you're confronted with this pavement, this jigsaw puzzle of floating ice that extends out to the edge of your imagination in all directions. And the only other topography down there at all are these floating mountains of blue ice that saw at the sky like jagged teeth. And it's the most humbling place I've ever been, but this is all just a backdrop, because the pack ice ecosystem is actually the richest ecosystem in the world if you measure in biomass. And most of that biomass is actually krill, so the minkies and the orcas navigate down through this sea of ice, finding the most improbably small breathing holes to take a breath of air and hunt this bounty. As you go deeper into the ice, Adelie penguins zoom past the edges, leaving these bridal veils of bubbles in the cerulean blue water. They explode out of the water and onto the ice and leave parts of their stories written in the snow. In the skies, snow petrels dart around like pieces of origami that are tossed to the wind. And I wish I had the time to go into each of these stories in detail, because these natural histories are fantastical. For instance, you probably know something about the emperor penguin and the males standing for months of Antarctic night, each with a single egg on their feet, protecting this precious package from the deadly cold. But you probably don't know much about their diving physiology, which is just as profound. So these are the deepest diving birds in the world. They get down to 600 meters with dive times of up to 25 minutes. And just before a dive, an emperor, you'll see them standing on the edge of the ice. They'll start flapping their wings. And what they're doing is raising their heart rate up to 250 beats a minute to hypersaturate their body with oxygen. When they hit the water, they go right back down to their resting heart rate of 60. And over the course of a long dive, they can slow their heart rate to just 6 beats a minute. And when they pop out of the water, they immediately return their heart rate up to 250 beats a minute to replace all that oxygen. And in doing so, they actually replicate the stresses of a human heart attack on each dive. And of course, that's just the view from above water. When you drop below the ice, shades of cyan replace the veils of white, and there in the blue light, the seals sing. Cool. So wet-tailed seals are the southernmost mammals in the world, and they live in the Ross Sea all year long. But to pull this off, they must, at times, dive half a mile deep, enduring the pressure of a car crusher, stay submerged for an hour and a half, and eat their way through the ice to keep their holes open in the dead of winter. So in each interaction, each encounter, I knew I was witnessing this masterpiece of evolution. Fish that make their own antifreeze, sea spiders the size of dinner plates. And each of these creatures is just supremely adapted to the unimaginable rigors of living in a sea of ice. So now that you know a little bit more about the Ross Sea, I want to back up and tell you about its importance in the context of the world's oceans and explain why I committed 12 years of my life to trying to tell this story. And it all started with this Antarctic researcher, David Ainley. Just to give you a sense of the man, he's published over 200 scientific articles, but none more important than these two in 2002 and 2004, where he first described the Ross Sea as the last large intact marine ecosystem left on the planet. And it was the second of these two papers that found its way to my desk. And at the time, I knew very little about oceans, actually embarrassingly little about oceans. And the idea that there could be just one last place left on the planet untouched was kind of, it blew me back. As did the rest of this paper, which describes the threat to this system, which is a deep water fishery for the poorly understood Antarctic toothfish. It's the largest predatory fish in the Southern Ocean, plays critical roles in the ecosystem, and of course it's sold, if you don't know, as Chilean sea bass around the world. Now the Ross Sea toothfish fishery is the southernmost fishery in the world. It's the most remote fishery in the world. And catch levels were ramping up without the very basic natural history information to ensure sustainability. Until last year, nobody had ever found an egg. Nobody has found a larval fish. Nobody knows where they breed. Nobody knows when they breed. Nobody knows how often they breed. Really, the only things we knew about this fish is that they live into their 50s and they start breeding when they're in their late teens, which marks them as a likely candidate for overfishing. So I couldn't get this story out of my head, and I eventually hunted David down at his house in California. And during that first meeting, we committed to each other to work together and make a stand and call for a marine protected area in the Ross Sea. But how to do that? Because any protection would have to run through CAMLR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which is the international body responsible for managing the Southern Ocean, and where all decisions are actually unanimous. So we would have to convince 24 nations and the EU that this was a good idea. So how to do that? Well, to start with, CAMLR is exceptionally well designed to incorporate science into its resource management. So David created a flood of science, working with like-minded scientists to rigorously demonstrate the importance of the Ross Sea as a living laboratory and describe the effects of climate change on the system and identify potential ways in which the fishery could interfere with the system. But what was really missing from this whole thing was like a meeting of the minds, a master paper that incorporated science from across disciplines and created the basis for forming a marine protected area. So that's what we did. We called that meeting of the minds in 2009, and it resulted in this paper, which became the basis for the design of the marine protected area. We used that paper to collect scientific consensus from over 500 scientists across the globe, and in 2010, the US became the first national sponsor of the marine protected area. But that didn't stop the science, of course. The scientists reinvigorated, kept on publishing on climate, on ecosystem dynamics, and of course on the fishery itself, and basically put CAMLR on notice that the world was watching. At the same time, we needed to bring this story to audiences across the globe. So early in this process, I came across a partner in New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young, and later in Cassandra Brooks, an Antarctic researcher. This woman would become my wife, and she is holding an Antarctic toothfish in this photograph. So you can probably guess where that conversation started. And together, we formed The Last Ocean. I wish I had time to pay homage to all of these people and organizations in these lists, because each of them contributed a critical support during some part of the project. But suffice to say, we had a lot of help. And by 2009, I had been down to the Ross Sea 4 times, 3 times on ships, 1 time as a guest at the National Science Foundation to dive under the ice for 3 months. Peter had joined me on one of those trips to the Ross Sea, and he had followed the path of the toothfish from hook to plate all across the world. And with 160,000 images and 250 hours of film, we went to tell this story to the public. We started publishing articles, and by the end of the project, the images had been published thousands of times in publications all across the world, reaching a global audience approaching 100 million. Peter took his film, toured the globe, winning awards. I published a book that was distributed to top diplomats, and we were invited to speak everywhere from elementary schools to actually addressing the CAMLR delegates themselves. And of course, we developed partnerships with other organizations, each working in each of the CAMLR countries. So what we did is we took this obscure place at the bottom of the world and we brought it into the mainstream. We gave it a face. We branded it. And by the end of the project, we had 1 million signatures. supporting this initiative. The Ross Sea was actually known as the last ocean, even on the floor of Kamilar, and we put Kamilar on notice that the world was watching as well. So let's take a look at how that scientific pressure and this public pressure and eventually diplomatic pressure played out on the floor of Kamilar. Well, actually, the UK gets the pole position here because they started talking about marine protected areas in 1996 in Kamilar. Now, the U.S., when it took that the Ross Sea initiative on, was quickly joined by New Zealand, and in sponsorship of the bill, and supported by Australia and Belgium. When it finally came to the floor in 2012, 9 more countries added their support, and the Ross Sea MPA looked like this. Now, over the course of the next 2 years, the MPA proposal was actually cut down by 40%, but in return, all but 2 countries were on board. And that takes us to the man who basically took the Ross Sea MPA initiative across the finish line. So in 2013, working with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we were able to gain the attention of Secretary of State John Kerry. And Kerry spoke about the Ross Sea, but more than that, he took it on as a personal cause. He wanted this to be part of his legacy. And in the lead up to the 2015 Kamilar meeting, he brought the story to President Obama, who spoke directly with the Chinese president. And that's what brought China on board, but with one last negotiated concession, which was a krill research zone on the west of the Ross Sea. That left only Russia in opposition. And in 2016, Kerry was again working behind the scenes with Minister Lavrov, and it came to agreement just prior to the 2016 Kamilar meeting. So let's get back to this photograph. This is a picture of Gillian Dempster. She is the head of the New Zealand delegation, and she's holding a signed map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area moments after adoption on October 28th, 2016. Despite considerable concessions to the fishery and a limited duration clause of 35 years, this is currently the largest marine protected area in the world and significantly the first large-scale international marine protected area. And I wish you could have been there on the floor of Kamilar when this happened, and this room of stoic international diplomats erupted. And people were standing and laughing and cheering and crying. Nations were literally hugging other nations. And so I want you to understand that this wasn't just a massive win for Antarctica. This wasn't just a massive win for our global oceans, though it was both. This was a peace treaty. And finally, I want to say that I've been working on the Ross Sea MPA for 10 years before I really understood what was at stake. And that all became clear with the birth of my daughter. And so and what happened there, what happened in Kamilar, gives me hope that if enough of us speak up and commit ourselves to making a better world for our children, then that's just what we can achieve. And that's what we must do. Because when one story ends, others are just beginning. So, thank you very much.